really appreciate you all tuning in. We started off with some technical difficulties on our GoToWebinar. The audio wasn't syncing for folks, so if anything, we figured Zoom would be better. We all live in Zoom these days. I'm sure you've been hearing about it, and it actually is working, and it'll come through. And shortly, we'll have Chris, our colleague, joining as well. So let's just go ahead and get started. So just a quick refresher, and Jen, if you can go to the next slide. We are CareAcademy. We are the #1 provider of online training designed for mobile. We are mobile first, actually, and so we offer home care agencies portable records. So if you need your direct care workers, any of their records regarding training, we have that available and available for you to port from one agency to the next. And then we offer 160 hours of training and an online dashboard, all for your convenience. And of course, last but not least, we offer customer support. Your direct care workers, as well as the admins in your agency, have the ability to get that customer support directly, whether by phone, whether by text, or whether by email. And of course, we offer an API integration. We announced earlier in the year integrations with ClearCare as well as AlayaCare. So lots of opportunities for your agency to get integrated. I want to thank you everyone again for joining us in this time. Submit your questions and responses below for Dr. Reddy as well as Chris Futo. I have the pleasure of having them on the panel today. We know that we're in really interesting times, considering that as of yesterday, the U.S. have passed any other country in terms of the number of COVID cases. So we want to make sure these roundtables, and we're going to be hosting them on Zoom from now on, are an opportunity for you to ask questions and get your questions answered by our esteemed
Ellen, can you hear me?
Yes!
Yes.
Woo!
Yay! Okay, I'm here, guys.
Yes, we take all the wins in this age of COVID. So yay! That's a win for the day.
Okay, we did it. We did it. Now I'm gonna go leave and get all of my papers, which I left in my kitchen.
So while Chris is doing that, because he's prepared for your questions, we're going to go ahead and start taking questions below. So go ahead and submit your questions. In the meanwhile, we'll just go ahead and go into the next slide, Jen. So Dr. Maduri Reddy, besides being my co-founder and our Chief Medical Officer, is our esteemed guest. So Dr. Reddy is the Chief Medical Officer and co-founder of CareAcademy.com, is a specialist in internal medicine and geriatric medicine and holds appointments at Harvard Medical School and Huber Senior Life. For years, she's been seen firsthand the struggles that families and caregivers go through while caring for older adults. Dr. Reddy, go back, please. Thanks so much. So Dr. Reddy has published several research papers in prestigious medical journals, book chapters, and also a book for families and caregivers. So a wonderful addition to our panel today. And of course, Chris Futo, our miracle today, which is, I'm super excited to have you on. If you can go to the next slide, Jen, there we go. There we go. So Chris Futo is a counsel in the firm's, he works at Foley Hoag, a counsel in Foley Hoag's labor and employment practice, and co-chair of its COVID-19 task force. So he focuses on representing and advising employers in all aspects of labor and employment law. And I'm sure you all have some of those questions as it regards, family leave and a whole host of other questions. He defends clients against discrimination and harassment claims and represents clients in union, wage, and hour and contractual disputes. Chris also counsels clients regarding personnel matters. He has advised clients in a wide range of industries, including banking, energy, retail, hospitality, food service, technology, insurance industries, In addition, he has experience representing employers before the National Labor Relations Board. So a wonderful addition today, especially because our focus will be on a healthcare update and also insofar as your employment concerns as it regards your care workers. So with that being said, Madhuri, I'm going to go ahead and hand it to you. If you could just give us a quick update of what's going on in the world right now, what do our agencies need to know, and we'll get into your questions right away. But just a quick set of highlights, Dr. Reddy, in terms of what's going on clinically.
So I know that everybody is kind of confused about what to do, especially regarding personal protective equipment. That is what the majority of questions coming in are about. And I would just like to say that infection control practices are changing rapidly, and over the last month, they've changed multiple times. I mean, if we had enough PPEs for everybody, and if they were infinitely available, we'd use them much more widely, but unfortunately they're not. Now, the CDC, in fact, last week released a new set of criteria for wearing PPE, particularly masks, and I'll get into that in detail in a little bit. But essentially, we're not performing standard of care with masks anymore. We're reacting to a crisis situation, which CDC does define. And I'd also like to point out that CDC is saying that home health personnel are included as healthcare providers, but there's no more distinction as to whether home care agencies or home care workers are included in that definition, although they do say home health personnel include all paid and unpaid workers in the home. That's not clear to me, but maybe Chris will have something else to add about that. And I'd just like to kind of sum up this introduction by saying that these home care workers and other healthcare workers are a key resource in our community. If we don't take care of them, then they can't take care of all these people that are going to be discharged home. We need to take care of this resource, and they want to protect their families. So all of us are here because we really want to do right by them and going forward to their agencies as well.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it, Dr. Reddy. And so now, Chris, let's just get into some of the questions that folks are having. Are you live with us? Are you unmuted?
Yes. No, absolutely. Unmuted.
Great.
You can hear me, right?
Yes,
Good.
yes, we can hear you. We can hear you.
I assume everybody wants to talk about the Families First Coronavirus Response Act, which is the big employment act that came out last week. It was signed by the president, and I know there are a number of questions as it relates to home health agencies and skilled nursing facilities. So, yeah. Yes, go for it. I think that's actually our first question for today. Are we exempt from the provisions, e.g. unemployment, PTO, of the Families First Coronavirus Response Act, either due to size or fact that we are a non-medical home care agency in Pennsylvania? So I'll let you go ahead and respond to that. Well, yeah, so it's a federal law, the Families First Coronavirus Response Act. So no matter what state you're in, you are going to be subject to it if you meet the employer eligibility standard. So the question is, what types of employers are going to be subject to these new requirements? And essentially, in case you don't know, the requirements are providing up to 80 hours of paid, 2 weeks of paid sick leave at either 100% pay, or if it's related to caregiving responsibilities, roughly 2/3 pay, and then some caregiving additional FMLA requirements. If you qualify for the FMLA, the requirements, it's essentially an additional 10 weeks for some caregiver leave at 2/3 pay beyond that. So the law, controversially, excludes employers with more than 500 employees on the grounds that it would be such a large, given if you have that number of employees, it could be, the argument is it would be too much of too
much of a cost for employers of that size to be able to handle. A lot of dispute about that. But otherwise, if you have less than 500 employees, you are a covered employer under the Families First Coronavirus Response Act. The act, however, authorizes the Department of Labor to exclude certain healthcare providers and emergency responders from the requirements of the act. The problem is right now we are waiting for regulations from the DOL to tell us who it is defining as an exempt healthcare provider or emergency response provider. We don't know. And I can tell you there's a lot of action going on in Washington where industry groups who represent home healthcare providers are lobbying to make sure that they're included in whatever definition of healthcare provider the DOL puts out. So we don't know if you will be subject to this if you're a home healthcare provider as we sit here today. We're hoping to get clarity on that soon, as the law goes into effect pretty quickly, goes into effect on April 1st. The other potential exclusion is for employers with less than 50 employees. If you can show that giving the leave would jeopardize your business, the DOL is allowing people to apply for exemptions from the requirements. Again, we're waiting for the regulations to decide to set forth what the qualifications for applying for such an exemption are, because they're going to only be given on a case-by-case basis.
Absolutely. I definitely appreciate that. Here's another question, and I actually, think that it would be helpful if let me just see if we can go directly to this question that we received actually from someone earlier in the week. I'd like an update on just, the implementation of the Families First Act. Are the tax credits given simultaneously with the payment of these new benefits? And will the credits offset the additional expenses? What are the critical provisions agencies should be aware of? So I think my takeaway from that is regarding the tax credit and what critical provisions agencies should be aware of.
Right. So the tax credits are not simultaneous, but they are. So you're permitted to exclude. They are 100% reimbursable. So what the way the IRS is saying that it's going to go about handling this is that it'll essentially be a payroll tax offset. You retain that amount of money at the time where you go to pay your payroll taxes. You retain the amount of money that you're going to pay, that you normally would have to pay to the government in taxes and payroll taxes, would be retained from that payment for the amount that you're paying. It also, if after that offset, that still doesn't cover the amount of the amount you're paying to your employees in this new paid leave, you can request an expedited advance refund from the IRS. The IRS is still working out the process of how that's going to be. Apparently, there's going to be a form where you can fill out and request an advance refund, and they're promising that you're going to get refunds within 2 weeks. I'll believe it when I see it, but that's essentially the strategy, the taxation strategy that they've employed. It's an offset, and then if the offset doesn't cover it, then you can apply for a refund.
Awesome. Thank you so much. So I have, just because she's been so patient and she's one of the first folks who switched over here, I have a question from Irene. So Irene, what I'm going to do in a second is unmute you. So I'm going to allow for you to talk. If you have a question for Chris or Dr. Reddy, go ahead and let us know. Irene, go ahead and ask your question. Oh, Irene, you there? All right. So Irene is not live yet,
but let's see if we can get someone on, let's see, unmute, let's see. Let's go ahead and, I think she's muted still. Okay.
Yeah, she's muted.
Okay. Okay. All right. No worries. So Shelby has a question. So we will have to wait for the exemption form 0, which hopefully comes into play before April 1st. Is that correct, Chris?
Yeah, I mean, so we do, I mean, the form, I don't know if the forms are finalized yet, but presumably they will be finalized in short order.
Okay, great. All right. So let's go ahead, and I'm going to my Q&As, and thank you so much. If you all have questions, type them up in the Q&A form. So has there been a decision made whether or not home care workers will be included as healthcare providers? Also, how do employers with less than 50 employees go about getting the exclusion for paid sick leave and FMLA?
Well, so yeah, as I stated earlier, no, it hasn't been decided yet. There are extensive lobbying efforts going on now. Industry groups are pushing the DOL to include them. We won't know until the DOL releases its final regulations on that, which we're expecting any day now. And that will also set forth the criteria that employers with less than 50 employees will have to go through in order to request an exemption from the requirements of the law. But it is, from the language of the statute, it is pretty onerous. It suggests that you'd only be entitled to the exemption if you, I don't have the full language here, but essentially it is, you can apply for it and you can get it if compliance with the rule would jeopardize your entity as an ongoing business. So essentially, you basically have to show paying this would essentially put you out of business.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. And Jessica asked, actually, I think we may have answered that question a couple times. Mark asked, as an extension of that, what can we do to get ahead of this big mess, right? More importantly, I'll maybe even expound on that. You know, what are resources that you would recommend that folks should be plugged into as things are happening in real time, Chris?
Oh, I mean, for me, so, I mean, a lot of this is going to be business decisions, and it's tough. I can say one of my takeaways from today is if you're involved in any industry groups, have your voices be heard. This is what they're there for. They are the ones that have lobbying efforts. They're talking to people in Washington, or they're talking to the DOL and providing their input into what they think, how the DOL regulation should come out, and make sure that home health care agencies are included in the healthcare definition. Otherwise, I think my only other advice would be, while your voices are being heard, prepare to assume that that you're going to have to give this as of April 1st. Now, the DOL has said for 30 days after the enactment of the act, so I think it brings you out to about April 16th. They're not going to move for enforcement if people are making good faith attempts to comply with the law. So you don't want to completely ignore it and wait for some hope that you're going to be exempted. So I would say prepare for it like it's going to affect you if you're under 500 employees, but at the same time continue making your voice heard through industry groups or other entities to let the federal government know that you think home health care agencies should be included in the healthcare provider definition.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Adele asks, is that less than 50 full-time employees, our staff are mostly part-time?
So the employee definitions for counting employees under the Act, it includes full-time and part-time employees, includes employees on leave, it includes temporary employees and who may be jointly employed by a staffing agency. It does not include independent contractors. So it's a pretty broad definition of who's an employee for purposes of counting an employee under the Act.
Great.
And that may go a long way for if you're on the upper end of a larger organization. If you're on the upper end, that may push you up into the 500 category more easily than you otherwise would be able to.
Great, thank you so much. And so Morsi asks, do we need to inform a client that a caregiver who's been in their home is being tested for COVID-19? They will not receive results for 49 days. Would this violate our employees' privacy rights? But do we inform them what that is possible that they've been exposed to the virus? And we have, I think, a number of questions even before this webinar that's, along the same lines. What would you suggest, Chris?
Well, so I'm going to defer to Maduri when it comes to what the medically the best practice is in this situation. From a legal perspective, you have to be it depends on the purposes of the disclosure. There are HIPAA requirements that you have to comply with, and also the EEOC put out some guidance under the ADA, but that made clear that if you are taking steps in this pandemic, this is such a unique circumstance that if you find out that someone is has tested positive for COVID, you can take certain steps to keep your workplace safe, and the extension of that is your clients. My view on that is I would obtain some type of authorization or a release. I know as a firm, my firm has prepared as we've prepared for this, has prepared a release that employers can give to the employees who are impacted to sign, to allow them to disclose the extent necessary is needed to protect the workplace, people in the workplace, and that would be, in your circumstances, would include clients. But also, I would also, even if you do get that authorization, you need to be discreet in doing it. You only need to you want to disclose only as much information as necessary to give people the information they need to protect themselves. So those are the two tips that I would have in terms of disclosing, because it is confidential medical information. You need to treat it as such. But if you get a properly drafted authorization and you are limited in how you disclose it to other people, I think you should be in good shape in this, because this is a unique time.
Yes, absolutely.
I would also add that where things are continually changing, a good course of action would be to call your local Department of Health or your state Department of Health and tell them the situation you're in, and then they will give you guidance on what to do, or they will tell you who to call next in terms of reporting.
Great. Well, I realize that these are unusual times. I think that's a really great transition. We're at 1:54, and so if my panelists don't mind, I think we're going to go on for a little bit if we can. Chris, Maduri, is that okay with you?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Yeah, I can take a few more questions. I do have a meeting that I have to jump to, so if you want to get a couple of more employment-related questions out before I jump off, that would be great.
Fantastic. All right, so let's keep doing it, and then we'll just even wrap up and get to some of maybe more medical-based questions. So if a home care is included in the healthcare definition and we decide to still provide the emergency paid time off and FMLA, would we be eligible for the tax credits?
Yes, you would be. If you are within the definition and you are required to pay it and you pay those benefits, you're going to be eligible for the tax credit.
Awesome. Okay, thank you so much. So I'm going to go back actually to another question from earlier. If employees choose, actually that's maybe a repeat of, let's see, and all right, I'm actually going to go into our questions from over the week. If a caregiver suspects they have COVID and decides not to start their shift, what must they do in order to not have their refusal be considered abandonment?
Right. So if you have I would say it depends on what your internal policy says. I'd want to check your policies in terms of attendance. I don't think you want to have a firm rule that says that a certain number of absences in every circumstance results in a job abandonment situation, because you have obligations under state sick leave provisions that already exist, and anti-discrimination statutes for disability that require you to make accommodations for disabled employees. So my view on that is you want to be in touch, you want to have a firm understanding of what your sick time, if you live in a state that has an earned sick time or paid sick time provision, what that provision says, make sure you look at your policy and see what your policy says. I can tell you that in Massachusetts, you can't even ask, if somebody uses sick time, you can't even ask them to provide medical documentation until 3 months, three work shifts have been missed. So it's all going to be a function of state law. But my view on that is before you want to make sure you have a uniform policy, but you also want to make sure that you give the caregiver every opportunity to provide the information it needs to validate the reason why it needs to be out. Now, we have a lot of situations recently where people just don't want to come into work because they're afraid of it. That's a different situation than people not coming into work because they have been exposed or they're experiencing symptoms. If they've been exposed or experiencing symptoms or have been diagnosed, I mean, that's a clear situation where I think you need to have more relaxed rules about your sick time policy, because you don't want to face a situation where you're putting somebody at one of your clients at risk where you have somebody who is coming into the workplace with potentially an illness. But at the same time, you want to treat everyone uniformly to avoid having issues where somebody says you treated me this way differently in this situation and not the other person, and therefore I think I'm being discriminated against.
Thank you so much for that. And another question, and this is really interesting and has some nuance. I have an employee that recently was exposed to COVID-19 and is now home on 14-day isolation. She's been working for me for 4 months. I have written her up on a multitude of broken policy issues. I would like to terminate her, but I am concerned about the timing. Would you advise to keep her in place until after the 14-day, or can I terminate her now?
Well, I think you want to take a look at that termination decision. I want to relook at that issue. So, and ask the question, why am I terminating now, as opposed to why didn't I terminate 2 weeks ago, or why aren't I terminating 2 weeks from now? If the only thing that's changed in this period of time is the person went out was sick and was exposed or was diagnosed and was going on isolation leave, and then you make the decision to terminate without any intermediary misconduct, I think that's a real problem. And I think you're likely to get some type of a complaint or claim there, because it appears, and I think that a Fair Employment Practices Agency would say, it looks as though the only factor that changed was the fact that the person went out on quarantine leave, and that would be retaliation. But that's why it's important during these times to make sure you're keeping good documentation about performance issues and acting in a quick time frame to make sure that none of these intervening situations or factors come in that limit your ability to make important decisions. So if she engages in misconduct again, there's no reason to retain her. The law doesn't require you do that. But if the only thing that's different is that she took quarantine leave, then I think your hands are tied.
And then something very, just to wrap it up, what kind of a notice do employees need to provide just in light of documentation, whether it's for childcare or any sort of stress or strain, or potentially because they've been exposed to COVID? Do employees need to provide any documentation? And likewise, do employers need to provide a notice of any sort of rights or documentation that needs to be provided?
Well, okay, so in terms of the employer notification, the DOL did put out a notice. It's on the US DOL website that covered employers need to provide regarding the Families First Coronavirus Response Act. that needs to be posted conspicuously in your workplace. If there is a Q&A about how to post it, so I advise everyone to take a look at that. You can also email it. I know I have a lot of people who are working remotely or don't come into a centralized office. You can email it or mail it to the person, and that would be cover for distributing it. In terms of notice to the employer, if the employee is having issues, I strongly recommend having a coronavirus-specific policy in place that lays out the groundwork for when employees are required to report to the employer that they have to let you know if they're exposed or experiencing symptoms, so you guys can take steps necessary to isolate those people from the workplace. And I think it's good to have it written down in the policy, because if you find out later that somebody was exposed or diagnosed, you knew it and didn't tell you, and you have a written policy in place, that enables you to take disciplinary action or take other steps if necessary. So that I would recommend having some type of policy in place that allows you to do that. And one last thing before I go, because I think it's important to note, because it was one of the questions I saw people asking about, which is I-9s and onboarding in this time. The USCIS has temporarily relaxed its rules on I-9. So usually if you get an I-9, you have to inspect the documentation in person. The USCIS has said at least for the next 60 days or until 3 days after the national emergency that was declared is no longer in effect, you can look at those documents remotely rather than have to inspect them in person. The 3 days rule still applies. You have to do it within 3 days of hire, but you can just have to inspect it remotely and then get a copy and retain and inspect that copy and keep that for your file. And then when you're filling out the I-9 paperwork, you can put in the reason for delaying the physical inspection of the documents as COVID-19, and that you're not, if you ever get audited by USCIS with respect to your I-9, that will protect you from having an I-9 violation. So if you need to look at that, USCIS put out a guidance on temporary flexibility for I-9. So if you're hiring in this time, I think and you may be doing that because if there's the need for home health care, it's probably going to skyrocket during this time. I think you want to be aware of that.
Awesome.
But thank you. Sorry, I have to sign off, but thank you all so much for having me and tolerating my the technical difficulties.
Thank you so much, Chris. Let's actually go, Jen, to his takeaways quickly. So just briefly, Chris, you're telling us until further notice.
Yeah, oh, sure, I can jump. My 3 takeaways are, until further notice, you need to assume that the FFCRA applies to you. We're hoping to have news on that within days, but you need to begin preparing for that as if it would apply to you. Stay in touch with your industry groups as these decisions were being made. I think it's important. I've mentioned industry groups a lot. I think they hold a key importance if you are members of them. That's what they're there for. During times like this, when laws and regulations are being crafted, they need to hear your voices. You can also, contact the Department of Labor yourself if you're not part of an industry group and say, I'm a home health care provider, and I think that home health care providers need to be included in the healthcare provider definition. And then last, and this is not to generate business, but this is from me seeing good people, well-meaning employers make too many mistakes that are costly to them. When there is any doubt about whether you're complying with the law, I suggest if you ask your employment lawyer. And if you don't have an employment lawyer, I think, you look for one. I've seen too many clients that are well-meaning and are trying to comply with laws have technical violations or not take into account certain factors which could be problematic for them and get into trouble. And so it really does help to consult with an employment lawyer before making important decisions which could result in liability for you.
Thank you so much, Chris. Really appreciate it. And thank you for tolerating also with our technical transition. We'd love to have you back. I know we'll definitely need you back as well.
I would love to come back at any time with technical difficulty free.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate it. So the website and all the things that Chris mentioned, we'll check back in. I know that we have a couple folks who are asking for technical clarity insofar as some of the websites and the materials that he mentioned, specifically around the I-9 and the website. In our feedback with this specific recording, as well as the email that we send out after this recording goes out, we'll make sure to include some of those resources, including Foley Hoag's information and their COVID response team that Chris sits on as well. Maduri, I don't know if you had anything that you wanted to add in terms of takeaways, and I'll give people a chance, if they have any last-minute questions that are specifically on the healthcare side, would love to hear your takeaways, and then we'll give people a chance to ask any last-minute questions on the clinical and the medical side.
I can just do my takeaways, or can I go into a few minutes of detail about the masks? Because there were so many.
Yeah, go ahead and present the takeaways as well as the mask piece, and then we're waiting for questions to come up. Mm-hmm.
Okay. So for my takeaways, I would say the CDC recommendations, as I mentioned in my introduction, the recommendations for masks and other PPE are constantly changing. So I have a link there where they describe that this should be done for all home health personnel. That's their language, and they don't have anything more specific for home care workers. But what it says there is that during a crisis situation, you're going to have to do things differently than deviate from the regular standard of care. So they kind of lay out three different sort of scenarios. The situation one, if there are plenty of face masks and plenty of the N95 respirator masks, direct care workers still don't need to wear the N95 masks unless they are performing what the CDC calls aerosolizing procedures. And that involves treating a patient that is using nebulizers or CPAP. And there's other things that the CDC defines as aerosolizing as well. Situation two would be, for example, if there are no N95 masks available and limited surgical masks available. So in this case, the CDC recommends extending the use of the regular face masks, surgical masks, and even possibly reusing them. And they do have some specific recommendations for how to do that. Don't touch the front of your mask. When the caregiver is done with them, fold carefully, put in a paper bag or airtight container, and so forth. And I encourage you to check the site for that, the website for that. Also, in that same situation, prioritize face masks for selected activities, such as during care where there might be splashing or bodily fluids, for example, incontinence care. And for doing activities where prolonged face-to-face or less than 6 feet contact with a COVID suspected patient or client is going to happen. When there are no N95 masks, the third potential scenario might be if there's no N95 masks or surgical masks available. The CDC states that workers that are at higher risk for severe illness of COVID-19 perhaps should be not be providing care for those with suspected or known COVID-19. So this includes home care workers of older age with chronic medical conditions or who are pregnant. They suggest also perhaps assigning the home care workers who have recovered from COVID-19 themselves to taking care of those who have COVID-19 or are suspected of having COVID-19. And actually, it's not for sure that if you have had COVID-19 that you're going to have immunity, but they think so. And finally, if there are no other options, the CDC states that you might have to resort to the homemade masks, bandana, scarves, et cetera, for care of patients with or suspected COVID-19. But the homemade masks are really not comparable or as effective as a regular surgical mask, but in these times, they may be all we have. And You know, you may have heard in the community several people are making them and putting HEPA filters in, or vacuum filters, or all kinds of things. So my second takeaway, I just wanted to stress, because again, we get so many questions about the N95 mask, and even in the hospitals for people that are working directly with vented patients, where even they are having difficulty with the N95 masks, home care workers are very unlikely to need those N95 masks, again, unless they're helping with these aerosolizing procedures. And finally, as I mentioned briefly, that consider your allocation of staffing for COVID positive patients with COVID positive staff, et cetera. And I have a link there. It's a link to the CDC site for crisis alternate strategies. So yeah, I think it's just important that these aren't regular times, and to constantly be checking in or checking the CDC sites or your local Department of Health, et cetera, because these are just changing continuously. But, you know, we talked about this in the last webinar, that if it's not clear what you do, you need to go forward and do the right thing.
Absolutely.
What you think is the right thing.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Marjorie. Really appreciate that. And again, thank you all so much. We have recorded this webinar. In spite of all the challenges, we recorded it. And then moving forward, we will utilize the Zoom platform. I realize that some of you who may be watching the recording didn't have a chance to enter in. We're going to work with Zoom to increase the number of folks who are able to participate on the next one. And we're really excited about the guests that we have coming up. We are going to keep hosting folks from COVID task forces, so you can ask a lot of these sort of legal and technical questions and utilize this as your time. Once we get sort of a hang of this, we'll also start taking your questions live. So if you're coming onto this and you've asked a question and our staff has reached out to you, be prepared to ask your questions live on the air. And we'll have a lot more time next time. We're going to keep doing these week over week until we're through this. We found that, if anything, it has been a tremendous resource for us, for all of you all out there, just to hear your questions and what's happening in your world. And hopefully we can not only be a resource to you and your staff and your agencies, but also you be a resource to each other. So we'll record this, we'll send this out, as well as some of the resources mentioned on the webinar. And again, I ask you, in these very unusual times, take some time to appreciate, what you have, take a breath, and if anything, we will see you all next week. We'll send out new information on how to access CareAcademy's Roundtable on Zoom. Thank you so much again for joining us. I really appreciate it, everyone. Bye-bye. Thank you.